Hello, and welcome to China Forum, the leading program for discussing the latest in trends and development in modern Chinese culture, politics, economics, and social issues. My name is Shannon Tiezi, and I will be your moderator for our program today. On this episode of China Forum, we are happy to host two distinguished experts on China-Africa relations. We're joined today by Ambassador David Shinn. Ambassador Shinn is an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, where he has been teaching since 2001. Ambassador Shinn served for 37 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, including as ambassador to Burkina Faso and Ethiopia. He is the co-author of China and Africa, A Century of Engagement, published this year by the University of Pennsylvania Press. A specialist on the Horn of Africa, Dr. Shinn is the co-author of the Historical Dictionary of Ethiopia, which he is updating and revising this year, and has authored numerous articles and book chapters. He has his BA, MA, and PhD from GWU. We would also like to welcome Dr. Deborah Brautigam, the Director of the International Development Program at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, where she also serves as a professor. Prior to that, Dr. Brautigam served as a professor at American University's School of International Service. She has authored numerous books and book chapters. Her two most recent books are The Dragon's Gift, The Real Story of China in Africa, and Taxation and State Building in Developing Countries, Capacity and Consent. I'd like to welcome you both today to this show.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to be talking about the relationships China has been forging with various African countries, especially the economic relationships. Over the last 2 decades, China's engagement with African countries has increased dramatically. To start out with, I would like to ask our guest to tell us a little bit about the drivers of China's involvement in Africa. Why now? What are China's motivations for increasing engagement? We can start with Ambassador Shinn.
I would suggest there are 4 drivers for China's interest in Africa today. The first is access to natural resources, oil, minerals, to some extent agricultural products. The second is as a market for China's own exports. You have a growing middle class in Africa, and it's more attractive to exporters than it was 15, 20 years ago. Third is a desire to obtain as many African votes as possible in international fora, such as the United Nations, where Africa constitutes more than a quarter of all the members of the United Nations. And last, and somewhat related to that point, is the fact that China has a very strict one China policy. It would like to replace Taiwan in all countries around the world. There still are 4 African countries that recognize Taiwan, and eventually Beijing would like to have that diplomatic representation instead of allowing it to go to Taipei.
Great. Dr. Brautigam?
I think that's a very good outline of what China's interested in Africa, but I would say one more thing, which is that Africa is, when you look at China in comparative perspective in different parts of the world, China's engagement is growing everywhere. So if you go to Australia, they say China's really booming here. If you go to Latin America, everybody's interested now in what China's doing in Latin America. So what we see in Africa is being paralleled in other parts of the world. It's not as unusual as it might seem if you're only looking at Africa. From the African perspective, China's engagement is growing huge, but that's the case all over the world.
Obviously, when we say Africa, we're using one term to describe a huge continent that has not only numerous countries, but numerous cultures, languages, peoples, governments. So I would just like you to kind of discuss the ways that China is not just engaging with Africa, but with different countries. China has different levels of engagement. And what are really the factors that help determine where China goes within Africa with investment or political outreach?
China has a major trade deficit with about 15 of these countries, the principal oil and mineral exporters, but it has a huge trade surplus with another about 30 countries, and these tend to be the poorer countries that don't have as much to sell to China, and the others are more or less in balance. So each country has a very different kind of a relationship, and you can go down through investment, through aid, through security interests, and find significant differences from one country to the other. But the fact is that China is very deeply engaged in all of them, except for the 4 that still recognize Taiwan.
Thank you.
And even in those 4, it's interesting that Chinese businesses are engaged and Chinese trade is large. For example, Burkina Faso, where China has no diplomatic relationship, it's the largest supplier of cotton to China from Africa. So that relationship is very strong. And there's an interesting development recently where the Chinese have a program to work on cotton transformation and to assist countries that are involved to upgrade their cotton sector and add more value locally. And Burkina Faso is actually involved in that program. So that's an unusual form of engagement for the Chinese government to actually partner with Burkina Faso.
Great. And I think that brings up the other half of the equation that we need to talk about, which is when we talk about China, there's different forces at work there too. Most people think about China's involvement in Africa as economic, but it also involves not just China, the government, but various Chinese businesses and independent Chinese contractors. So what can you tell us about maybe a way to separate out the actions of the Chinese government and the Chinese businesses, many of which are state-owned?
I think there are several ways to look at this. By and large, I would argue that the interaction between Chinese businesses, either state-owned, obviously state-owned, or even private Chinese businesses have a somewhat closer connection to the government than is the case for private American companies and the U.S. government, where the gap is greater and where the ability to finance either contracts or finance investment is somewhat more difficult to do just because of the system of our government. But these nevertheless are important distinctions to make, and clearly the Chinese government has a far closer relationship with state-owned companies, in which cases some of them are led by senior members of the Communist Party, and they're part and parcel of the government for all practical purposes. But there are actually more private Chinese companies operating in Africa today than there are state-owned companies. The difference is the state-owned companies have the greater dollar value because they're much bigger companies. The smaller companies, or the private companies, tend to be smaller.
Okay. Great. Dr. Brautigam?
And I think it's the private companies that have been getting some of the headlines for bad corporate social responsibility practices. For example, in Zambia recently, there's one Chinese company that's been in the news over and over again for conflicts and labor problems and violence with its workforce. So that's a private company. And it's difficult, I think, for the Chinese government to use leverage to try to control or ameliorate or improve those practices. Whereas with the state-owned companies, they have a lot greater leverage. And we see fewer cases of state-owned companies with really poor labor practices or really bad corporate social responsibility.
There's another component to this which is perhaps the most interesting of all and is becoming increasingly a challenge for the Chinese government, and that is the increased numbers of very small traders, Chinese traders and business persons who on their own, totally private, are going off to Africa to make money. And in some cases they have connections with their family or friends back in China for a supply source. They set up shop in a variety of African countries, sometimes with or without work permits. And if they get work permits, some African competitors are asking how they got the work permits, because these are very tiny operations. And they work very hard. They have very efficient operations, and they're tending to put some of the African competitors out of business. And there were protests, for example, in Kenya when I was there last week by Kenyan small business people who felt that these were people who should not even have gotten work permits to come in, assuming they had work permits. It's been a bigger problem in southern Africa, where this issue has been a very hot one for several years, but it's starting to expand around Africa now.
Okay. This is an interesting issue, and I can see also, I agree with Ambassador Shinn that this has caused political problems for the Chinese and also for the governments that don't crack down on their own immigration controls. We can see a lot of differences. For example, I've spent time in Ethiopia over the past couple of years on a research project, and you don't see these Chinese traders at the entry level in Ethiopia. They're restricted to the wholesale level, where they're quite active, but they're not there at the street level. And the Ethiopian government has rules and it enforces them. And and that's not the case in a lot of other countries. There's one other thing I'd add to that, which is that the proliferation of Chinese traders has a positive side for African consumers because the competition has driven down prices, which is part of why some African traders have gone out of business. But it's led to greater product choice, greater variety, and cheaper prices. And so the consumers often appreciate having these greater choices, while the traders who are competing with the Chinese don't appreciate it at all.
Sure. And I think you've both touched on some problems that Chinese economic involvement in Africa can bring with it. Obviously, the competition from Chinese migrants, and then you also mentioned that sometimes there are labor violations, especially from the private Chinese companies. Do you see these tensions as having the potential to grow in the coming years? Do you think this will become a problem for China-Africa relations overall? And if so, how do both sides try to manage these tensions that are brought about by economic competition, labor violations, things of that sort?
I think it's going to depend entirely on how every individual African government deals with the issues. In some cases, they've been dealt with quite successfully, as Deborah pointed out, in the case of Ethiopia, and not allowing a lot of these small traders into the country to begin with. And a few other countries have done the same thing. I think that there will be some countries where this will become a growing problem and one that will cause increasing friction. I think it's also an area, and I've discussed this with Chinese embassies over the years, that they are aware of and they too are concerned about, and they also understand they don't have total control over all of these private individuals coming in. They don't like to have problems any more than the African government wants to have problems. They want everything to be absolutely problem-free. Well, the world isn't that way, and sometimes problems are created, not of their own making, that they have to grapple with. But it is up to the embassies and the Chinese government to try to figure out ways, working with the African governments, how to cope with some of these issues that are arising. And it affects not just China, but it affects other emerging nations that are operating in Africa too.
I think there's always a risk when you have a minority group that's economically successful. They can become a political tool to be used in political competitions and elections, for example. We saw this happening in Zambia, where the challenger to the government used the fact that there were Chinese businesses coming in, that there were illegal Chinese businesses, that the Chinese weren't always following the rules. He built this up into a campaign issue, and this led to violence during election campaigns against Chinese who had businesses, small and large, in Zambia. So this kind of temptation to use a successful economic migrant group or a minority group in your country as something for political leverage in an election campaign is something that's happened against a lot of immigrant groups in a lot of countries, and we've seen that even in our own country.
Right. In addition to Chinese businesses, both large and small, the Chinese government is also fairly involved in giving foreign aid, foreign investment, and loans to African countries. Recently at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, they announced they would make available $20 billion in loans over the next 3 years. So obviously, there's a lot of money that the Chinese government is willing to spend on Africa. And you touched on this a little bit, Ambassador Shinn. Are there political gains that they're hoping to make from these economic investments that the government specifically is making?
I'm not sure that there are political gains specifically from foreign aid that they're hoping to make. I think it's the combined package of their engagement with the African countries, where they're hoping to solidify their relations and also to ensure that the African countries remain a source of supply for raw materials. Aid contributes to that, but I would argue that aid is probably not the most important feature of it. I think a combination of trade and investment in terms of sheer dollar value loom larger in that equation. But Deborah's the expert on aid. I'll let her take that one.
The Chinese, year to year at this point, the finance that's going into Africa is over $6 billion per year in terms of commitments. That's not all being used every year. But to put that into perspective, I would say the large proportion of that is not what we would consider foreign aid. It would be loans at a more commercial interest rate. That would be, for example, London interbank offered rate, LIBOR, plus a margin. That's the common way in which most of that finance is committed. And foreign aid would be about $2.5 billion and rising, but at much lower levels. To compare that to the United States, we're putting in about $8 billion a year in economic assistance to Africa. And then there's all of Europe. So the figures are still relatively, compared to the West in general, it's a relatively small package. And I would agree that most of this is, has several purposes, and that's economic. And the economic purposes are to generate trade, to generate markets, to generate business for Chinese companies. So that money is tied to Chinese exports by and large.
I think there's a general perception that China is coming to kind of outstrip the West in terms of its engagement economically with Africa, despite the West maybe having a longer history with some of these African countries. Do you two think that that's an accurate perception or maybe a misperception? And if there's any truth to it, what are the factors that are giving China a boost in terms of its economic engagement?
If you look at China versus just the United States, for example, in the last several years, you perhaps could make that argument. Although in the case of aid, it's $8 billion from the United States, $2.5 billion of real aid, OECD-type aid from China. But if you look at trade, China surpassed the United States in 2009 as the major trading partner with the 54 African countries. If you look at investment, although figures are very elusive on investment, my guess is that there is more new investment going into Africa today from China than from the United States. But then the question is, well, do you compare just China and the United States, or do you compare China and, say, the West more generally? And if you do that, then clearly the combined numbers coming out of the West are larger than the numbers for China by a considerable margin. China does get something of an advantage in terms of the types of projects that it's engaging in on the continent. And these are not, for the most part, aid projects. These are contracts that they win for major infrastructure, building dams, roads, bridges, repairing railways. These are widely seen by the Africans. They're generally welcomed, and the Africans associate that with aid. But in fact, most of these are just contracts that have to be paid back to the Chinese government.
It's interesting that often when a Chinese company is carrying out one of these contracts, people see the Chinese company there doing the work, and they assume that the Chinese are financing it. I was in Kenya also recently where the Chinese are doing a major urban bypass, and people all call it the Chinese road, and it's actually being financed by the African Development Bank and the Kenyan government. There's no Chinese finance at all, so they're getting a big boost. And I think that may be in part why public opinion polls across Africa, by and large, rate the Chinese favorably. And they also rate us favorably, and they rate the Europeans favorably. So there are exceptions in a few countries, but if you look at the average, it's a positive rating for all. And so what that says to me is that it's not a zero-sum game. A gain for China doesn't have to be a loss for us. It can be a win all way around.
And there are a lot of other players out there. There are the Indians and the Brazilians and the Turks and the Russians. So it's not just Europe, the US and China involved here. It's a very big playing field today.
Sure. Going back to the public opinion point that you mentioned, I think it was 2007, Pew survey of sub-Saharan Africa in 10 countries. 9 of those countries gave China a majority positive rating. They said China has a positive influence on their country. Fairly high numbers for the US, but not quite that high. Would you tie this to China's economic engagement, or is there more to China's soft power going on here in Africa?
I would say that it's probably the economic engagement and also the publicity that surrounded that. We have to look at 2008 as being earlier in this period when there were still, China was still seen as something new. It wasn't new, but it hadn't been as visible before. The work that I've done on China, I've been doing it since 1983, and I've had a lot to do research on in Africa. So Chinese have been around for a long time on a smaller scale. But in general, they were looked at as being helpful. They would build bridges in visible places. They would build stadiums that people enjoyed watching sports in. And so in that sense, that was looked at quite positively, and they got a lot of soft power. And then also the Chinese economic growth at home and the reduction of poverty at home. People looked at that with some admiration. How did they do that? They've done a great job at development. So those things also are sources of soft power for the Chinese, and I think can contribute to that positive feeling that maybe the Chinese can do something positive in our country. And in successive years after 2008, I think there's been more of a critical backlash against this view of the Chinese as being broadly positive. However, it hasn't yet resulted in a really strong impact on public opinion polls. And it's not just Pew, there's also BBC, there's the Afrobarometer, and there are others that have looked at this. And they haven't seen any big drops, but not quite as positive as it was in 2008.
Another feature of this is I think the United States has to deal with some negative issues that China doesn't have to worry about. In North Africa and the Horn of Africa, for example, the counterterrorism policy of the United States is sometimes looked at with a bit of a jaundiced view by some Africans. So we get a little bit of negative backlash on that. And the mere fact that we're still essentially the world's only superpower, that comes with a certain price, and sometimes that's a negative price. So I think that hurts even a little bit in Africa, although much less so than in the rest of the world.
Sure. Now, when the West looks at China and Africa, it tends to be with a little bit of suspicion. And part of that, I think, comes from accusations that China has a no strings attached policy with their aid, that they're willing to give money maybe to countries that have human rights problems, to dictators. And there have even been accusations that Chinese companies are funneling arms into African countries where the UN has arms sanctions on them. So do you think that China's influence in Africa is being kind of warped by these negative perceptions in the West, and that overall it's mostly positive with a couple outliers, or are these legitimate concerns that African countries might be more concerned about?
I think there is some nuance when you speak to Africans about their concerns about China. They differentiate these issues, and certainly there is concern about Chinese being the arms suppliers to the continent, and people worry about that fueling conflicts, intra-country conflicts and conflicts between countries, and that role has been increasing. For the Chinese, the sale of arms into Africa or worldwide is another form of business. So they see this as a business kind of venture, and companies are being very aggressive in seeking out deals. They're showing in all the arms shows where we show, and they're trying to move up the value chain and capture higher value markets. We don't sell much in Africa anymore, except to a few countries that can afford our products in the arms. We're still selling to the Middle East and other places where they have more money. But I think that the human rights issue is also something that concerns particularly the non-governmental sector in Africa, civil society. They're concerned about Chinese partnering with any government that will partner with them and having economic relationships and not using sanctions. By and large in Africa, though, I don't see this tainting the overall relationship between China and any given African country. I think it's a concern, but I think there's also a recognition in African countries that there's a lot of hypocrisy in the West's concern about this, because they say, well, China has a poor human rights record at home. They're not a democracy. They have a lot of problems, and yet the West engages very enthusiastically economically with China, but then they tell us, beware. And so they say, there's something wrong with this picture.
On the arms question, China in the last couple of years has provided about 20% of the conventional arms globally that go into Africa, which is a fairly significant percentage, and it's a rising percentage if you look at the percentage historically. If you add in small arms and light weapons, for which there are no reliable figures, the consensus is that that percentage is even higher. So there are a lot of Chinese weapons that are flowing into Africa. I think that the government of China sincerely tries, and in fact for the most part does, keep these weapons out of conflicts in a direct sense. On the other hand, it has been documented that some of them make it into conflict zones in Darfur, in Somalia, in the eastern Congo. It's not that the Chinese government is supplying them to those conflicts, but if you supply arms to Sudan, and China is one of Sudan's major arms suppliers, and Sudan somehow allows them to get into the Darfur conflict, then they show up in Darfur. And there's not a lot that China can do about it, but it still puts them in an embarrassing position. Also, China is one of the major arms suppliers to Zimbabwe, and both of these countries are under at least U.S. sanctions.
Okay. Let's turn a little bit to U.S., China, and Africa, kind of the triangle. Recently, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton made a trip to Africa in early August, and a lot of her comments to African leaders were taken as kind of a backhand critique of China. She talked about countries who look the other way and keep the resources flowing, a nod to this sort of issue. And also, there have been accusations from the U.S. that China is involved in neo-colonialism, taking natural resources from Africa. Do you think that this is a sign that the U.S. is trying to compete with China for African engagement? How should we understand Hillary Clinton's remarks?
I think you have to look at a couple of statements that Secretary Clinton has made in the last year and a half or so. An earlier one was in Zambia, where she actually did use the term referring to China as a neo-colonialist partner. The wording that she used on the most recent trip, and I believe it was in Senegal where she made the speech, very carefully avoided not only the reference to neo-colonialism, but it avoided any reference to China, although very clearly she was referring to China when she was chiding certain countries of using the continent primarily for a resource base. I'm not sure that I would describe the U.S.-China relationship in Africa as one of competition per se, because there frankly are some areas where there is cooperation going on. In UN peacekeeping operations, for example, the United States is rather praiseworthy of what China has been doing. They have some 1,500 personnel involved in 6 of the 7 UN peacekeeping missions in Africa. China has cooperated, albeit independently, not as part of a international group, on the anti-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden. But what they've done has been very helpful, and the U.S. has praised that. Where you run into what I would call competition, it really is the commercial side where businesses are competing with businesses. It's just that simple. To some extent, there's competition perhaps for the battle of ideas. That's a little more subtle, a little harder to document, and I suspect some of that is going on. But it really is a very mixed situation where the United States in some areas is cooperating with China and others, and in other areas it has shown some concern about the impact that China has, particularly when it comes to the question of democratization and human rights in Africa.
Sure.
I think there may be some domestic politics going on as well. The State Department has to look at the Hill in Washington. And Congress has always had a much more deep concern about Chinese engagement, whether it's in this country or in other parts of the world. And they've been clamoring for some kind of action against different Chinese companies or against the Chinese government more generally for things like overvalued exchange rates and so on. So there is a very strong feeling on the Hill that's much stronger than the State Department normally, the positions the State Department takes. And so it could be in part that Hillary Clinton's pronouncements are directed at the Hill and saying we are aware of this and we're taking some action, we're trying to differentiate ourselves as much as it might be to Africans.
Well, thank you both so much for that wonderful discussion on China and Africa. I certainly learned a lot. And we hope to see you again on China Forum. And we hope to see our viewers back again next week.